Nurit Ben, thanks so much for joining us for this special broadcast brought together by the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. 11 examples, 11 stories. So what is this all about? In 2016, 31 member states adopted the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, part of what they called a shared responsibility to identify and then fight anti-Semitism and xenophobia. Basically, when it comes to a threat that's increasingly on the rise, a way for governments and institutions around the world to speak the same language. Since then, more nations have joined and the debate over it continues. They list 11 different forms of contemporary anti-Semitism happening in all corners of public life, in all corners of the world. But a definition can seem abstract, even meaningless. So why does this language matter? Coming up, you'll hear those words on paper come to life. For each of those 11 definitions, 11 personal stories that reveal just how tangible they really are. Also joining the conversation, several distinguished guests who have dedicated their work to fighting the ancient and modern problem of anti-Semitism. And right here with me in the studio, Sasha Roitman-Dratwa, Executive Director of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement that is behind this whole event. But first, a quick glimpse at who they are.
In the course of human history, sometimes people have come together to make great progress, to free people, fight for equal rights, and overcome evil. People of conscience have also stood up for the Jewish people in times of distress, to create the State of Israel after the Holocaust, and liberate Jews from the former Soviet Union. But now we must come together again. Today, innocent people are being berated, beaten, terrorized, and murdered simply because of their faith. It's happening in places with large Jewish populations and in places where Jews are virtually alone. Today, Jews are being attacked from the far right, the far left, and by a new form called anti-Zionism. Jews are being targeted online, on campuses, on the streets, and in the halls of important institutions. While many organizations and individuals are combating the scourge, more must be done. So the Combat Anti-Semitism movement was created. This grassroots movement is bringing together hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals dedicated to making the world better. The movement has a wealth of tools to combat this hate. A digital platform that enables everyone to participate. A website where activities of terrific organizations are shared. A newsletter that disseminates critical news. A forum for people to tell their stories. Contests that enable winners to fund their ideas. And we're giving everyone the chance to join in now. The movement will use its collective power to influence governments, institutions, students, and more world leaders.
Anti-Semitism must never be tolerated.
L'antisémitisme en France, c'est d'abord et avant tout le problème de la République.
We cannot, we must not, and we will not ignore it or tolerate it.
Working together, people have accomplished great things. Now it's our turn to come together and help turn hate into hope, anger into understanding, and anti-Semitism into an anathema forevermore.
So we've just heard a little bit about what CAM is all about. And Sasha, its executive director, here with us. Tell us why it was important for you to have this event at this moment.
So thank you, Nurit, for introduction. Thank you to all that are watching us online today. And a special thank you to our guests that will take the time to be with us. We are going to hear from leaders from all over the world, like the United States Special Envoy on Combating and Monitoring Anti-Semitism, Ilan Carr, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, Ahmed Shahid, Lord Speakers, Dr. Felix Klein and O. Becker, on how their countries or institutions are leading the fight against anti-Semitism. As Nurit mentioned, we'll hear from 11 personal stories, but why it is so necessary. At the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, we represent 275 organizations and also more than 285 individuals. We hear every day from people from different backgrounds how anti-Semitism impacts their life. Each story is different. Each story is another Jewish person who was broken. It is devastating to see that each time the reason is different. It comes from the far right, far left, from radical Islam and others. Each time is another argument used why to hate Jews. This is why at CAM we understand the need of defining anti-Semitism better. It is a key step in our fight. Our message is clear. We stand ready to help anyone who are ready to work to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and to fight back this oldest form of hatred. This event is our first step.
Thanks so much, Sasha. And you'll be with us throughout this broadcast to hear some of the amazing stories that we have lined up. But one possible, maybe the best possible person to break down what we're actually talking about here and why it matters is the chair of the International Holocaust Alliance herself, Ambassador Michaela Kuchler. She's also Special Commissioner for Ties with Jewish Organizations at the German Foreign Office. And those two roles cover a lot of ground, including working with major international groups to fight anti-Semitism. Here's her message to us all today.
Bucharest, 26 May 2016. The delegates of the member countries of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, agreed on adopting the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. While drafting this document, the IHRA and its delegates hoped it to be a useful tool to combat anti-Semitism. But who would have known at that time it turned out to have such a great impact? The working definition of anti-Semitism mainly contributed to broaden the discussions about all the various forms of anti-Semitism. At the same time, it led to vital debates around how we can identify and, most importantly, combat anti-Semitism. Notwithstanding all the important achievements the working definition implied, we know that anti-Semitism still exists today, and even more than ever. Even worse, anti-Semitism has arrived in the mainstream of our societies. Anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with hate and racism and should not have any place in our societies. It affects us all, and it requires every single one of us to combat it. 11 examples are given to explain the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. To those who claim these examples stifle the debate on how to fight anti-Semitism, I clearly say, no, it doesn't. Actually, it does the opposite. While people discuss and question these examples, they are giving them attention and deep thoughts, which hopefully will lead to understand the numerous and various shapes of anti-Semitism. Public awareness of this problem clearly has a long way to go. The IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism has the power to serve as a useful educational tool in this regard and can provide an essential mutual starting point for further discussions, as well as for action. With the agreement of 34 IHRA member countries to the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, they made an unequivocal and powerful statement. Most IHRA member countries reinforced their commitment to the working definition by adopting it at national, regional, or even local level through government or parliamentary resolutions or city council motions. Also, civil society identifies itself with the definition. In order to create broad public awareness, especially social media platforms, both big and small, have to acknowledge their responsibility, just like traditional media. Especially now, we must ensure that the fight against anti-Semitism and the education efforts can weather the storm of the pandemic, so that our democratic societies can emerge from this challenging time intact. With this in mind, I want to thank the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, CAM, for organizing this virtual meeting. Together we are strong, and together we declare to fight anti-Semitism wherever it occurs.
Thanks to Ambassador Kuchler. And starting us off from across the United States, U.S. Envoy Ilan Carr, Jonathan Morales, and Susan Libby. And let's really get straight to the heart of this special broadcast. 11 examples and 11 stories. For each of the international examples of forms of anti-Semitism, there are, sadly, countless very real cases. So we'll start off with one of the most clear-cut, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. In April of last year, in the picturesque city of Poway, California, a Passover celebration at a synagogue was interrupted by gunfire. A 20-year-old man with a rifle in hand and a hate-filled manifesto online murdered a woman and injured 3 more. Jonathan Morales was there, a Border Patrol agent and also a congregant. He joins us now from Poway. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us. And to start us off, can you tell us a little bit of how you recall that day through your eyes?
I went to service that day alone, and remember when we started the Torah service, it was around the 5th Aliyah when the Baal Kriya began to read, and the service was interrupted by gunfire in the entrance, the hallway to the synagogue. And there was a brief pause in the gunfire, and then it resumed again. And this time the gunfire was towards the Kiddush hall next door where all the children were playing. So then there was another pause, and that's when we began to hear the cries of women and children screaming. And at this moment, I knew we were being under attack. It was an active shooter situation. So I knew, I was ready to respond. I knew where a gun was hidden in the synagogue, so I knew what I had to do.
Right. Well, as a Border Patrol agent, you had a sort of background that I imagine no other congregant had. How did you react in the moment?
Yeah, I have 19 years experience in law enforcement as a Border Patrol agent. So we train for these type of situations during our firearms trainings and active shooter scenarios. So everything that was going on, my training just immediately kicked in, and I already knew what I had to do was, my focus was just to find him and eliminate the threat.
Before this happened, did you have any sense that this was something that could happen in your own community, or was it something that you maybe saw on TV, something that seemed a little farther off?
Yeah, and for me personally, I always thought, our shul area was relatively peaceful, and past few years that I had been attending there, it never came across my mind that they would attack us there. A small, quiet suburb, north of San Diego, north of the city, outside of the city limits. So to me, it was a shock, but, sooner or later, it was going to happen.
Right. That's, a sad testament to reality to say sooner or later it was going to happen. I imagine that's how a lot of Jews feel around the world. Obviously, an incident like this isn't just about one event or one day. It has a really long-term impact and a long-term scar. Can you talk a little bit about how you think this has affected your community ever since, or you even personally?
Yes, as far as the community, yeah, even though it's been over a year and a half, but people are still, shaken, hurt, upset over the loss of life and injuries that we all sustained, either physically, emotionally. And for me personally, it just makes me still be aware of that this can happen again, and we can't be complacent, even in our most humble, peaceful moments during a service while we're davening. We still have to have in mind in the back of our head that there may be someone that can enter through our doors and try to kill us again.
Sadly, Jonathan, that's something that so many people across the U.S. and around the world have experienced, this notion that something feels far off and that it could never happen here, and then tragedy strikes, and it does. And that's exactly the point of this conversation and all of these stories, is to remind us what the reality is right now, and that it can happen, and to be vigilant. Well, as we know, hate, including anti-Semitism, isn't confined to acts of violence that make headlines. Others are far more insidious, officially described like this: making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews or the power of Jews as a collective, like the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media or the government. Professor Hannah Newman is herself a Holocaust survivor and today is a tenured professor at Point Park University in Pittsburgh. Decades after surviving the Nazi regime, she was demonized right on campus and even kicked out over a false accusation. She's now being represented in a lawsuit against the university by James Lieber and New York Lawfare. Hannah is joining us now from Pittsburgh. Thanks so much for being with us, Hannah. So talk us through a little bit about your story. I mean, what happened to you there on campus where you're a professor?
Well, 2 years ago, 2018, I was suddenly told by the person who was then an acting director of Title IX that a student had filed a complaint against me. This came completely out of the blue. I came to school to teach a class, was told that the class was canceled, and was invited to speak to the HR person who was representing or acting head as Title IX. I was told to leave immediately, not to have any contact with any students. I didn't get any explanation. I did not get a chance to speak. I didn't get a chance to even ask how long this process will take. I was simply banished right then and there. I realized that this was the culmination of a campaign that started to try to get me silenced, basically to vilify me, slander, make rumors, start rumors about me, disable me from doing my job. And this was really the project, in my view, and I think I can prove it, of a professor who was hired, who did not disclose that he was basically not a professor of whatever he was hired to teach in the Global Cultural Studies program, but he was actually a trained advocate whose commitment to BDS. After the war, I was born in Russia because my parents were captured by the Soviets and spent time in Siberia. I was born there during the war in 42. After the war, we went to Israel. So my personal, connection to Israel is profound. And I view Israel as my family. And I was confronted at Point Park, as I said before, by somebody who was passionate advocate of BDS and who was demonizing Israel in his classes and recruiting students basically for the BDS activism. I felt personally, not just professionally, I found that abhorrent to just have one side of a very complicated situation presented to innocent students who were not knowledgeable. But I found it also, so this was a professional objection that I had, plus personal. I was personally offended by all these lies about Israel, presenting Israel as a settler state, as an apartheid state, comparing Israelis to Nazis. At every step, I brought my complaints to the administration and was not, the response was indifference, patronizing dismissal. And so this went on for quite a while. So when I was finally confronted with this horrendous lie, that I actually committed some kind of a, sexually inappropriate act. I knew that this was the last resort of strategy to get rid of me so that the demonizing of Israel, could go on.
Well, that's an issue, Professor Hannah Newman. Thanks very much for sharing your story. That is an issue that we're going to be getting further into detail when it comes to the Israel issue, anti-Zionism, and so forth, and certainly what's going on campuses. So thanks so much for sharing your story.
You're welcome.
So I want to move on to another example from the International Holocaust Alliance, another case of targeting Jews as a collective. They call it accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or a group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. Well, Susan Libby knows all about that firsthand from her time working in Chicago's public health system in the 1980s. That's when she heard a shocking and dangerous conspiracy theory being spread around her. Susan joining us now from Chicago. Susan, take us back to the 1980s, first of all. This is almost quite an extreme version of this case, of this definition of anti-Semitism. Tell us what you experienced.
I was the only Jewish person in my department, and it was kind of just when the AIDS epidemic was getting really, really bad, and it was coming into everyone's consciousness. I never thought anything like this could happen, but out of the blue, I had not known that much about Louis Farrakhan's ideology. I heard about his absolute hatred of Jews. I guess I had been unaware of that part of his ideology. And suddenly I heard that a very high up employee in the Chicago government, city government, who was a direct aide to Mayor Eugene Sawyer, had been broadcasting through media and other ways that our doctors, the Jewish doctors that had been working as public health doctors, and he had been spreading a rumor that the Jewish doctors who had been working in the public health clinics in the Black communities in Chicago had been injecting Black babies with HIV when they were vaccinating them.
So we're talking about doctors who are part of the public health system. They are doing, maybe the most important work there is out there to try to save people's lives during the AIDS epidemic, no less. And these are the kinds of accusations leveled against them. How did you react at the time? I mean, what could you do, if anything?
I was kind of numb because it was so out of left field. I don't even think I knew how to react. But suddenly I was kind of thrust forward, being the only Jewish person, and I was asked to answer the many, many calls that were coming in. They set up a special kind of a hotline at the Department of Health with people that didn't know what to believe. And I had to speak to those people and listen to this propaganda.
Do you think at the time, I mean, was part of this to do with people simply not being familiar? I mean, beyond ignorance, beyond believing this unbelievable rumor that was started against Jews, how many people had actually even met somebody Jewish? I mean, was it strange for you to be one of the only, if not the only Jewish person there?
I was not the only Jewish person in the Department of Health, but I was the only Jewish person at that time in the HIV program at the department. And I personally had a lot of personal experience with the clinics on the south side of Chicago. I went there quite a bit as an educator. I had a lot of experience with the community, I think, which helped, because I don't think a big part of the Black community actually believed this guy, but it was scary enough. And the most disappointing part of the whole thing for me was the fact that there was not a swift response from the Black politicians in Chicago. And it didn't come up again until this latest business with Farrakhan and these high-profile Black athletes, Black actors coming out and repeating Farrakhan's words. So this was like deja vu for me, only I think the Jewish community, it seems like they were a little bit more ready with the way they responded this time.
All right, Susan Libby in Chicago, thanks so much for sharing your story in the 1980s, pertinent today when we look at the rising levels of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and around the world. And I want to bring in now someone on the front line, really, of confronting anti-Semitism, including, of course, in the United States, where anti-Semitic incidents are also on the rise. Ilan Carr is the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Thank you so much for being with us, Ilan. Now,
well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Louise, and thank you to Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, CAM, for this incredibly important program at an urgent time, a time of rising anti-Semitism, as you correctly identified. And these two stories are heartbreaking.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that urgency that you mentioned, because we know that just like in the rest of the world, anti-Semitism is a rising problem in the U.S. We saw a report, I think it was just this past May, from the ADL that showed 2019 had a record number of anti-Semitic incidents, a record number. So as U.S. Special Envoy, what are you most concerned about at the moment?
Well, anti-Semitism is rising globally, and that's really the point here. This isn't an American phenomenon. America still remains the most philo-Semitic country in history, but even in America, anti-Semitism is rising, and it's rising in Europe, and it's rising in other parts of the world. It's a global problem. I arrived in Halle, Germany, to visit the scene of the Yom Kippur, the awful Yom Kippur attack that claimed innocent lives. And I arrived specifically in Halle, Germany on October 27th, the 1-year anniversary of the murders at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Cemetery Synagogue, to make the point that this is a global problem that requires a focused, coordinated global solution. What worries me in response to your question is that we won't bring sufficient urgency to it. We have to understand what anti-Semitism is, where it comes from, the level of venom and hatred that it brings with it, the irrationality of it. And here we saw a perfect example. Jonathan described the murderous nature of it, and Susan talked about the irrationality of it. Doctors injecting babies, and we see this now today with COVID-19. Baseless claims that Jews have developed the virus or are intentionally propagating it or seeking to profit from it. And so we have to understand what anti-Semitism is, define it, and then bring the full range of resources at our disposal.
I want to pause you. I just want to pause you right there on that important note of understanding what it is, because it seems so basic. You would think everybody understands it, but it is more complex than that. And that's a big part of what we're talking about here. And the U.S. for years has adopted the international definition, IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. Can you explain a little bit why, on a practical level, that's actually helpful in fighting anti-Semitism in your experience?
Oh my goodness, it's more than helpful. It's critical. It's foundational. How can you confront an enemy when you don't understand the enemy? You have to define an enemy. You know, I'm a former Army officer. I kind of, you know, I kind of understand that you can't confront an enemy unless you understand and define it first. And we have a vehicle for doing that. We have a standard definition of anti-Semitism that defines it. And it's critically important because sometimes, because of context or because of history or because of geopolitics, the anti-Semitic nature of a certain movement or of a certain expression or of a certain statement or of a certain advocacy will be lost in the moment of the geopolitical realities or of certain other political considerations. And so, but when we define anti-Semitism and when we have an objective definition to which we can all refer, it allows us to be on the same page and understand what we're fighting. And then of course, to combat it, which is the necessary step 2.
Ilan, one of the things we're going to be looking at a little bit later in this broadcast are the definitions of anti-Semitism which deal with Israel, with anti-Israel sentiment, and that very fine and very sort of volatile line. What's your take? I mean, what have you observed in terms of anti-Zionism as a new form of anti-Semitism?
Well, that's exactly one of the most important points about the IHRA definition. The fact that through its examples, it encompasses not only traditional forms of anti-Semitism, you know, blaming Jews for the problems of the world as we've just covered, but also what's often referred to as the new anti-Semitism, you know, targeting the state of Israel as a Jewish collectivity, denying the Jewish people self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor, comparing Israel to the Nazis, subjecting Israel to a double standard. And so this is very important because it makes very clear that hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. And so much of anti-Semitism today is focused on the Jewish state, the one Jewish state in the world. And we have to consider that. That's why President Trump signed an executive order last December that specifically protects Jewish students on campus from harassment and discrimination. This is something we're seeing not only in the United States, but on many university campuses in Europe. And Jewish students are being attacked. This is primarily through anti-Zionism and hatred of Israel. and it is anti-Semitism. And so the IHRA definition here too is such an important tool for understanding the threat that anti-Semitism poses and the forms that it takes.
So Elon, you've talked a lot about how important this definition is and how practically important it is. I mean, from someone in a position like yours and actually fighting it. So what is stopping other nations, other institutions from adopting it?
Well, nothing. In fact, more and more countries are adopting it. I can just highlight now Argentina very recently adopted the IHRA definition, and more countries are doing it. We had Ambassador Kuchler on before, and I want to thank her. I know a goal of the German presidency of IHRA is to have more and more countries adopt the IHRA definition, not only countries in IHRA, but actually around the world that are outside of IHRA. And so more and more countries are adopting it. But it's important that it's not just governments that adopt it. Here's what's key. Civil society needs to adopt it. Internet and social media platforms should be adopting it. Universities should be adopting it. And here is where it suddenly becomes controversial. There's nothing controversial about the IHRA definition, but the moment you start to confront those organizations that openly and repeatedly traffic in anti-Semitism, suddenly they say, no, we don't want to adopt the IHRA definition. And they'll throw out all kinds of things about free speech, nothing to do with free speech. Defining anti-Semitism doesn't stifle debate. It simply defines what anti-Semitism is, so we can engage in that debate by calling it out.
This is all meant to lay the groundwork for debate, not stifle debate. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about campuses also. We have a few personal stories happening on college campuses across the U.S. Elon Carr, U.S. Special Envoy, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up right now are three more powerful stories from around the world. Sammy Steigman, Rafal Pankowski, and Ilya Bratman all joining the conversation now. We'll also hear from Lord Eric Pickles. And let's get to one more example. Some of the most blatant forms of modern anti-Semitism are tied to the darkest chapter in Jewish history. In short, Holocaust denial. The international definition goes deeper, a little bit more precise, to denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of Nazi Germany and its accomplices. But still walking alongside us today are the people who saw it and lived it firsthand, the people who suffered through the most horrific atrocities imaginable and survived to tell the story. Sammy Steigman is one of them. He joins us now from New York. Sammy, thanks so much for being with us. I know your memories could easily fill a book, but tell us a little bit, for those who aren't familiar with your story, of what you went through in the war.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very honored to be here. I also want to say something that, for instance, the Holocaust, all the genocides, all the tragedies in the world can be summarized with one word: bullying. As a Holocaust survivor, I was with my parents in a labor camp in an area which is today Ukraine, called Mogilev-Podolsk. All three of us, my parents and I, survived. We were deported by the Romanians, not by the Germans. Interestingly enough, because I was only a year and a half, I have survived because, number one, they did medical experiments on me. And the side effects, I still feel them today. And I will feel them all for the rest of my life. The other reason is that when it came a stage that I was dying of starvation, a German woman who brought food to the guards in the SS, obviously she had access to the camp, she saw the physical sign that I'm dying of starvation, she decided to give me milk. But I spoke on May 6th, 2015, to 735 students in Bayonne, New Jersey. The reporter was there, and he wrote a very nice article in the New Jersey, what is it called? The New Jersey Journal. Okay. So that was, again, May 6th, 2015. 2 days later, May 8th, the neo-Nazis from New Jersey, okay, took that article word by word, but they changed the headline. And they put in the headline, the Jew Holocaust claims Nazi medical experiments you can't remember still cause them pain.
What did that feel like to hear that, to see that headline?
You want to see the headline?
What did it feel like for you to see that headline?
Oh, first of all, when I saw it, I really got upset. There's no question about it, you know. But I have decided to take a negative and to turn into something positive. So I'm going to explain it to you also. But what I do is I take that article and I teach the young people to realize that not everything that they hear, not everything that they see, not everything that they read is the gospel truth. They must do the research. So let me explain how I'm doing it. It took me about 2.5 months to realize that in that headline, they called me 3 times a liar. Number one, holohoaxer. Okay, obviously it's made up of 2 words, Holocaust, hoax. Hoax, it never happens. If it never happened, if I'm talking about it, it means that I'm a liar.
Right.
The other thing they say that I can't remember what medical experiments they did on me. They're correct on it, but they don't say why, okay, I can't remember. And I cannot remember for 2 reasons. Number one, the doctors that they did medical experiments did not come to my parents and tell them, this is what we did to your son. My parents also did not know. They did not tell me anything about it. Okay, the only thing that they knew is that I was experimenting. So they're using truth without giving any proof.
Well, on that note, I just want to commend you and thank you, because to have gone through what you went through and then to find the strength so many decades later, not only to speak out about your story, but to face people, to face that level of ignorance and people who say this entire thing was invented, it takes an extraordinary amount of strength and bravery, I think, and is so important in preserving the memory of the Holocaust. So thanks so much for sharing your story and how you're working to kind of stop this denial going forward. And I just want to bring in one more form of that, of this sort of Holocaust denial that is coming up a lot, and that is accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Now, Rafał Pankowski was targeted by Holocaust deniers in Poland, no less, the same place where some of the Nazis' worst atrocities were carried out less than 75 years ago. He's joining the conversation from Warsaw. Rafał, it's pretty unbelievable to think of this happening in modern-day Poland, given the history there. Tell us a little bit about what your experience has been.
Well, thank you for having me. Anti-Semitism in Poland, of course, is not a new phenomenon. We know it has existed for a long time. But I'm afraid what we have seen in the last couple of years, especially since 2018, has a kind of revival of anti-Semitic discourse in Polish media, in Polish politics. And I have been a member of Never Again Association, which monitors and calls out anti-Semitism in Poland. And we, for many years, published a magazine under the title Never Again. I think the message is obvious. And we condemned and criticized one particular author and broadcaster who actually published a book in which he referred to the Holocaust as a myth. And he said the Jews are responsible for the construction of what he calls a myth of the Holocaust. And he actually accuses the Jews of being themselves responsible for the Holocaust. He says the Holocaust was organized and supervised by Jews themselves, which obviously is a shocking statement, but it is especially shocking and unacceptable when it comes from someone who works on state-controlled, state-owned television, and who is a popular pundit on the Polish media.
Yeah, and we all know that media and books in this kind of position certainly hold a lot of power. Really important to know from you firsthand that in Warsaw, in Poland, this is the kind of thing that is happening today. Rafał, thanks so much for sharing that experience that you have in Poland and what is, I guess, a modern reality happening there now. And I want to move on for a moment from what we've been talking about around the issue of the Holocaust and this international definition to one of the most talked about and debated forms of anti-Semitism today. It has to do with Israel. When is anti-Israel sentiment just criticism, and when is it simply hatred for Jews? IHRA itself is clear, the international definition, that criticism of the Jewish state that's similar to any other country is not anti-Semitism. But that is not always the case. One very modern example, the claim of double loyalty, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to their own nations. Ilya Bratman saw this firsthand, and no less while serving the United States Army in Korea. Ilya joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, your story is pretty incredible. You're an Army sergeant. You served tours in Korea, in Germany, in Iraq. What exactly did you experience as a Jewish soldier serving your nation, the United States?
Thank you so much, Narit, and thank you, Sasha, for inviting me. I'm so blessed to be here to speak about this. And I'm so thankful to the IHRA definitions, which will strengthen our ability to combat anti-Semitism, especially on campuses worldwide, and especially in the United States, where, as you have seen, anti-Semitism has grown significantly. I had, as you said, the privilege to serve in the United States military. And when I was in Korea, I had a very particular experience. And while serving amongst my peers who come from the variety of New York and variety of the United States. So I was serving on guard duty on the border of South and North Korea. And there I was sitting just with one other gentleman who was from one of the southern states, white soldier, and he knew that I was the only Jewish soldier in our battalion. Battalion of 540 soldiers, I was the only Jewish soldier. I made sure that it was known. It was a very big part of my identity at the time as a Russian immigrant and as a Jew. It was such an important part of who I was. And I would make sure that they knew that. And there we were sitting, and we were sitting by a stove that was burning and warming us up as we were in the winter at the border of South and North Korea. And he looked at the fire inside this little oven, and he said, "You know what this fire reminds me of?" I said, "I don't know." He said, 20,000 Jews burning in it. And I'll never forget that moment when I realized, I could have responded with incredible anger and aggression. But I realized the amount of disinformation and lack of knowledge that this young man has had. And I proceeded to explain to him the idea of the Holocaust, which he knew very little about, and to hear his story. And he grew up in South Carolina, where his grandfather was one of the members of the KKK, and where he was taught that the Jewish people could not be trusted, that the Jewish people were part of a secondary identity, that the Jewish people wanted to represent something else and had always a second home or another place that they really represented.
This notion of double loyalty that we're talking about.
Right, exactly, that they especially couldn't be trusted in the military. And if he saw Jewish people in the military, that he couldn't trust them because not only Israel, but there was something other, clandestine, shadowy, some kind of second identity that they, as Jewish people, would purport to. And he believed that wholeheartedly. He even at times, he said when he was a young man, he believed that the Jewish people had horns and the Jewish people were some kind of a beast of a nation that could not be trusted, and they had allegiance to something else, something clandestine and dark. And he couldn't believe that there was a man serving next to him in the same uniform, in the same way as he did. And this whole experience showed him an incredible light to what the truth was, that the Jewish people. Yes.
Well, I mean, that moment, I think your teaching moment back then during the war is really a teaching moment for all of us and for everyone watching. And it takes a lot of strength as well to be confronted with that kind of thing as a Jewish soldier, a U.S. soldier no less, fighting for his country, to take that time and to realize that it's a lot of times simple ignorance. It's a lack of education. It's somebody who's never actually met a Jewish person before or another minority before. So a really important takeaway from your story, to actually try to teach, to try to educate, and not just, get angry. So I want to move on from there to somebody else really who knows all of this firsthand in terms of fighting anti-Semitism on a global scale and where it stands today. Lord Eric Pickles, he's a board member of the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, a former member of British Parliament, and for the past 5 years has served as the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues. Thanks so much for being with us, Lord Pickles. At the heart of what you're doing is sort of making sure that the UK plays a central role in Holocaust education and documentation and the welfare of victims. And we know that this has been an issue, not just in education in the United Kingdom, but also in politics. So how would you sort of describe the status of anti-Semitism in the UK today, first of all?
Well, we've been through quite a process with our opposition party, the Labour Party. And thanks to their then leader, Mr. Corbyn, we have a very clear idea of why there was so much unhappiness with the IHRA definition, which incidentally was part of the team that brought that definition in. And it's a matter of some pride that the United Kingdom was the first country in the world to adopt it. And basically those who object to it want to do basically four things. They want to be able to compare Israel to Nazi Germany. They want to be able to suggest that Israel is an apartheid state. They want to be able to place different forms of way in which you judge a country, different for Israel from the rest of the world. But as you rightly say, the most insidious is about wanting to suggest that Jewish people have a dual loyalty and they are in some way a fifth column. I mean, this was kind of brought home to me in the March of Solidarity after the Charlie Hebdo killings. And I was at home watching the march, and a reporter for the BBC, which is the last bastion of the liberal establishment in Britain, went up to a French woman who spoke excellent English and said, surely this terrorist outbreak is a direct result of Mr. Netanyahu's decision on settlements. I mean, that was an outrageous thing to do. They're not comparable. And here is this French woman who may have views about Israel, may have visited Israel, may support Mr. Netanyahu, may not support Mr. Netanyahu, and yet she was being brought to account for some murderers in Paris.
Lord Pickles.
So it's really important. It's really important to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's really important to ensure that when people are saying this, they need to be exposed as anti-Semitic.
Well, I want to stop you there just to ask how widespread that is, because that kind of case, I mean, is that something that you feel is really across British society or British discourse at this point?
Well, I mean, we've had various surveys. The Community Security Trust did a survey, and out lunatic anti-Semitism, the kind of, that Jews have horns, we're talking about a tiny percent, less than 3%. But the more worrying thing is that we know from surveys that maybe 30% of the population, even if they are well-minded towards Israel or well-minded towards Jewish people, believe some of the tropes about Jews controlling the press or Jews having a lot of money. Behind me is an artist representation of our new Holocaust Memorial and Learning Center. And when we were doing the consultation for planning, people were coming up and saying, well, it's because the Jews, they control Parliament, that's why you want it there. Wow. And we really need to bear down on this anti-Semitism. And that's why the IHRA definition is so important, because it deals with the modern nature of anti-Semitism.
I want to zoom in on one very quick political issue there, because it's hard to talk about anti-Semitism without mentioning the Labour Party. We've seen under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership years fending off allegations. Do you think that that is changing at all?
Well, certainly we have a new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who belongs to a completely different wing of the party. And I think that Mr. Corbyn allowed and cultivated anti-Semites inside the party, so that Mr. Starmer's got quite a formidable task to remove that from the party. As a Conservative, I actually wish him well, because the Labour Party is a great political party that has traditionally been anti-racist, has traditionally stood up for people from different backgrounds. So it was a deeply shocking thing to see it being taken over by an anti-Semitic wing. We will have the full reaction to our Equalities Commission, who are looking into allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party over the next few weeks.
We'll look out for that. Lord Pickles in London, thanks so much for being with us. And I do want to jump back quickly to Sammy Stigman, still with us in New York, who's been listening along. Sammy, I know you had something else you wanted to add, listening to all these conversations and some of the other stories.
First of all, anti-Semitism, hatred cannot be eradicated. It can be only minimized through education. The neo-Nazis, okay, accuse me that I'm a liar, okay, but they are not providing. This is something that is very important. They are not providing any proof, any evidence. As a matter of fact, I applied, okay, for compensation because I was subjected to medical experiments. Now, keep in mind that the Germans did not want to pay if they could get away with it. Now, I did not, I don't know what they did to me. So number one, strike one. Number two, I was homeless, which means I had no documents. And number three, okay, when I applied in 2002, February 8th, everybody was gone. So basically, I had absolutely no proof. And the Germans, not only did they answer to me 2 years later, but what they did is they paid me 2,500 German marks, one single payment. But what they did by that, they acknowledged that medical experiments were not done only in Germany by Mengele, that it was done in other countries also. So what the neo-Nazis do, they use, okay, certain things that are true, okay, but they do not provide, okay, the evidence.
All right, Sammy Stigman in New York, thanks again so much for sharing such a painful part of your history, but as we mentioned before, such an important one to speak about and to speak publicly as we're talking about some of all of these issues. Some of the definitions are all about Holocaust denial, and there's no better way to confront that than hearing from a survivor himself. Sammy, Rafal, Ilya, thank you all for sharing your stories, and of course to Lord Eric Pickles for joining us from London. And Sasha, you're still here with me, of course, and I know you at the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement have a contest underway. You're looking to get students around the world more involved in exactly what it is we're doing here. So tell us how they can.
Yeah, thank you, Norit. So this is very relevant to our discussion today, and it's called Students Speak Out Against Anti-Semitism, an initiative that was launched with our great partner, Bnei Brit International. So first of all, pay attention, everyone. The deadline of the submission has moved to October 15. We're inviting university and high school students to submit a short video educating on the anti-Semitism and the IHRA definition and why it's so important to use. The winning videos will be distributed by CAM and Bnei Brit as well. And the top winner will receive cash prizes of $5,000 for the first place, $2,000 for the second place, and $1,000 for the third place. So let's have a look.
you're just joining us, I'm Nuree Ben, and you're watching 11 Examples, 11 Stories. In this special broadcast, the official international definitions of anti-Semitism told through powerful personal stories from around the world. And we have some more special guests coming up to join the conversation with their stories. Chen Mazig, Laurel Grauer, and Carrie Nelson, all with us, along with Dr. Felix Klein. And earlier, we heard a bit about the increasingly blurred line between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. And that comes into play in another form laid out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavor itself. Joining us now from London is Chen Mazig. He's an Israeli writer and activist who frequently speaks to communities abroad. And Chen, thanks so much for being with us. I know you give a lot of talks on college campuses. We've been talking a little bit about campuses. We know that this is sort of a breeding ground for, let's call it, intense modern debate. What is some of what you've seen there?
Wow, it goes all the way from denying Israel's existence as a whole to suggesting that Jews are superhuman, that control the world, and have this agenda to oppress non-Jews. That my family are actually, although my family is from Iraq and Tunisia, they're actually white Europeans, that they came from Poland, although my grandmother came from Iraq and my father came from Tunisia, but that doesn't matter. So the most, ludicrous and insane lies that you can think of, people denying me being a gay person that speaks about LGBTQ rights in Israel, to say that it's pinkwashing. Everything I'm trying to say about Israel, or every time I'm trying to speak about my experience as an Israeli, being denied and shut down and just silenced on campuses because, we can't speak about anything that is not against Israel's existence. As soon as I'm speaking about Israel in a positive light, immediately I'm being shut down.
So you are an activist. You're talking and speaking out about this to crowds and encountering what it sounds like an enormous amount of pushback and really just simply ignorance. What do you do about that? I mean, what kind of conversations are you having? What do you find that you do that maybe works?
I think that just bringing my own personal story and continuing to speak up. And I always say that, I don't fight anti-Semitism. I fight for the Jewish people. And there's a difference because I choose to be driven by love for my people rather than hate for those that want to destroy my country and my homeland. So I'm always trying to share how beautiful the Jewish community is in Israel, how 55% of Israeli Jews are Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, some from Africa as well, that we are a diverse people, that all we're fighting for. When people say, well, I'm an anti-Zionist, I want to have a debate on it, it's just, it's not, I just don't find it an issue that we can debate, because you're basically denying my existence, and you're calling for the death of my country and the death of my family. Israel saved my family. Zionism for me means my existence and my family's life. My family were refugees. In 1951, no one opened the gates for the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. So to be an anti-Zionist, it doesn't mean to engage in a conversation that is critical about Israel, which there is a conversation to be held about Israel. And for me, as someone that is very critical of the government, there's a conversation that we can have about the government and about politics. But the conversation is not about that. It's not about criticism. It's about denying the existence of the Jewish state. And that's something that we're not seeing with any other country.
In those conversations and everything you're exposed to, do you feel a difference is there a line drawn between being Jewish and being Israeli? Because those are obviously two different things, but seem to be getting blurred a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think you're right on the issue here, that the lines are blurred. BDS, to boycott Israel, doesn't really do anything to the Israeli economy, and we all know that. But it will harm Jewish students that are Zionists. 95% of American Jews are Zionists. The global Jewish community are by and large Zionists. The anti-Zionists that are being pushed forward are a tiny minority. I mean, they are harming me and they are harming Israel, but not as much as they do to the Jewish community. And I think that me being Israeli, I'm an easy target. But when they're fighting against me and when they're fighting against Israel, they're actually fighting against the Jewish community. It's becoming the politically correct way to be an anti-Semite these days.
Well, having the conversation like we're doing now is a really important place to start, at least to then hopefully have the debate. Chen Mazig in London, thanks so much for giving us a glimpse into what's going on right now in college campuses in the UK and really around the world. And I want to extend this part of this conversation a little bit more because according to the international definition, one more part of what we're talking about is a double standard, requiring of Israel a behavior that's not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And that's an especially divisive issue that tends to come into question really every time Israel is involved in conflict. And it's also been a part of several recent events, including the prominent Women's March group in Washington and the so-called Dyke March in Chicago. Laurel Grauer took part and found it was not all about gay pride. Laurel, thanks so much for being with us. So you were there. This is meant to be one thing. I understand it turned a little bit into something else. What did you encounter at that march?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. So the Dyke March is a parade that's been held over 30 years, and it's meant to be a space it lauds itself as an inclusive space, a place to raise diverse gender and different sexual orientation voices, and also a place for collective social action. And that's why I was proud to march in the parade for over 10 years with my Jewish pride flag, which is a flag with the Jewish Star of David sewn onto a rainbow field, which I obtained from my LGBT synagogue, Congregation or Hadash. And I had marched over 10 years without incident. What happened, however, in 2017 was that as my colleagues and I were coming off of the field and finishing the march, immediately volunteers and organizers of the Dyke March began to harass us and tell us that we had to put away our flags, that they were making people feel unsafe. And when we asked, well, how is this making people unsafe? And we're seeing there are Palestinian flags, Mexican flags, I think it was a Filipino flag in different signs and flags for coexistence. Only we were being approached. They said that this is an Israeli flag. It's a sign of apartheid. It's a sign of racism, colonialism, and it's not welcomed in the space. Again, when we were trying to explain this is celebrating Jewish and gay identities, and it's used by Jews around the world, they would not listen to us. And then second question was, are you in fact Zionists? And I said, yes, I believe in Israel's right to exist. And I want to see it exist in a peaceful future next to a sovereign Palestinian state. And at this, I was told to not only put away the flag and to leave, but that I could not be a Zionist and believe in two-state solution at the same time.
Lauren, I just want to, in the time we have left, to ask if you were to be able to send a message to people watching around the world, and certainly to people in that community or some of the people who kicked you out of that march, what would you want to tell them? What would you want them to understand?
Again, there were some people, and I think whenever you have these kinds of conversations, there are hardliners who are very much stuck on their narrative and how they see things and equate Israel with every evil social action you can imagine. However, in even those very exchanges, and even the exchanges I have now as JCRC director, there are people caught in the middle who don't know enough and could even see the wheels turning and question, is this right? Are we really living up to our standards if we're holding a double standard to this one person for this one thought or this one flag or this intertwined intersectional identity? Are we really living up to that? And I would say to those people, keep asking those questions, keep engaging in conversations, and please, if you are confused, at the very least, look to this definition as a guideline.
That's such a key point that you're talking about and really relevant. I mean, I think I don't need to tell people watching how relevant it is these days, just in general in terms of discourse, whether it's about anti-Semitism, other minorities, other xenophobia. Laurel Grauer, thanks so much for sharing your experience, an experience I hope that doesn't repeat itself at the Dyke March in Chicago. And what we just heard was a pretty brazen display of anti-Semitism, but they don't often require even one word. Sometimes it's much more subtle than that, less loud. Symbols and images depicting hatred of Jews and conspiracy theories about them have been around for centuries. And these days, the international definition notes those same symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. Kerry Nelson is joining the conversation now. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Illinois. He's authored hundreds of essays and a number of books on issues like education, culture, activism, politics, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Kerry, thanks so much for being with us, for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Well, I know that one of the many trends that you've been following is this. I mean, you might say anti-Semitism has been around really just as long as the Jewish people, and you're following an ancient accusation being used against Jews today.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why the numbered examples in the IHRA definition are so important, because they really help you identify what really are anti-Semitic incidents and discourse. And it also has tremendous educational value on campus and off campus. And, you know, the new anti-Semitism includes the return of irrational, hate-filled anti-Semitic accusations and conspiracy theories. We thought they pretty much died with the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. The Nazis, in one way or another, echoed and revived these medieval slanders, but they are now returning in different versions, including, you know, the single most dangerous accusation, which is that the Jews killed Christ, which is called deicide, killing God on earth. It arose 1,000 years earlier, but it's now returned. You see it. It started in the Middle East. You had an Anglican cleric from East Jerusalem, Naim Atik, say that Palestinians were, for all practical purposes, being crucified, just like Christ was being crucified. That Israelis were crucifying them on a cross. And then that became condensed into a phrase, Christ at the checkpoint, to suggest that every time Palestinians were stopped for security reasons, it was the equivalent of a kind of crucifixion. That became popularized in the Middle East, and then it spread to Europe and the US, and it's now a kind of refrain that gets used in anti-Zionist attacks.
Carrie, let me ask you, when you witness this kind of thing, these symbols being used, whether it's cartoons or otherwise, in your university, outside of it, what kind of a reaction do you see? I mean, is there some sort of collective understanding that this is not okay, or does it sort of go over smoothly?
Well, I think you have to start with how people who use those symbols feel. And they feel joyous at the use of them. They feel that that it's wonderful to revive anti-Semitic slanders, especially if they can get a visual image that captures it. So, for example, it's now quite common in the efforts to blame Jews for the spread of the coronavirus, which is, of course, completely crazy, but it happens. So you get images of the Star of David redrawn to look like the coronavirus, and those have circulated on the internet. They've circulated in newspapers in the Middle East and the internet in Britain, the United States, and Europe. And I think that people who use them feel great about it. I mean, they really feel that they've done something. I think for any supporters of Israel, and of course, especially for Jews, it's very wounding to see those images. And even if you've seen hundreds of versions of images like that, and even if you've gone back and looked at how they were used in the 14th and 15th centuries, when you see a contemporary version, if you're a Jew, there's still a huge sense of visceral shock. It's wounding when you see them. You can get over it. I mean, you can process it and understand where it's coming from. But this first sight of something so vulgar and hostile, that so full of hatred, is shocking. And it's even more shocking, I think, for students. I mean, if you're a public intellectual, you kind of expect a lot of aggression in your life. You stick your head up, you get criticized. But I think for young people and for people who aren't experienced at public debate, these kinds of phenomena are even more deeply wounded, and they can't process them so easily.
Right. Well, Carrie, thanks very much for sharing your experience, what you've witnessed there as a professor, as someone on campus, and really what you're mentioning, especially with coronavirus, really harks back, reminds me to the beginning of this special broadcast with Susan Libby. She was telling us in the 1980s about her experience facing accusations that Jews were behind the AIDS epidemic, and here we see 4 decades later these kinds of very ugly accusations and rumors rearing their heads once again. So thanks for being with us and sharing that story. And I want to bring in also to this conversation another person who is really on the front line of dealing with anti-Semitism, this time in Germany, when the German government decided to create a new office for Jewish life. Dr. Felix Klein was first to be appointed. Since 2018, he has been the federal government commissioner for Jewish life and the fight against anti-Semitism. And in part, it was born out of worry for rising anti-Semitism and even neo-Nazi groups in modern-day Germany. Dr. Felix Klein, thanks so much for being with us, for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So clearly what we've learned so far is there is a whole lot of education and improvement to be done around the world. So can you share with us a little bit of your sort of best practices that Germany has used to combat anti-Semitism?
Yeah, well, one of the first projects I started after my appointment was setting up a system for reporting anti-Semitic incidents, including those that do not constitute a crime. We have seen just and heard some very impressive examples from universities, and because the crimes are only the peak of a broader problem, and if we make the day-to-day anti-Semitism more visible, we get a much deeper insight into the reality, which then enables us to then fight anti-Semitism more effectively. We set up the system all over Germany, where witnesses and victims of anti-Semitic incidents can go to. It's a civil society organization. You can report what happened to you, and then you get counseling, psychological help, and also legal help if you wish to. That is a very, very good and effective thing. Another problem I encountered when I was appointed was that police and prosecutors very often do not discern anti-Semitism. Then they have a lack of understanding what anti-Semitism is. So this was the reason that we revised Section 46 of Germany's criminal code, which lists offenders' motives to be taken into account when setting penalties for crimes. And it is now my hope that this new law will guide police and prosecutors to consider when they have someone in front of them that they will apply this, and they will discern anti-Semitism as it is. The IHRA definition helps very much in that regard. And maybe a last important step we've done in Germany, we have just passed a law to combat anti-Semitism in the internet. Now the internet providers are obliged not only to delete anti-Semitic contents in the net, but they are also obliged to give the IP addresses, so the identification of those who spread anti-Semitism net to the police authorities, so that police and prosecutors will be able to identify them and to put them to court.
Well, Dr. Klein, on that point of dealing with anti-Semitism online, which I think we all know is maybe one of the most difficult and sort of endless problems that we face today, what role can this IHRA definition, can the international definition itself actually help in combating anti-Semitism online, on social media, for example?
I think the working definition set up by the IHRA is an essential tool in that fight, because like where anti-Semitism is a very, very international phenomenon, and when you want to fight a disease or you want to solve a problem also in real life, you have to define it first. You have to get the diagnosis then before you get make the therapy. So the IHRA working definition helps very much in the diagnosis, and it helps the platforms, but also police forces to identify anti-Semitism, particularly when you apply the examples that are listed in the working definition, and it helps also the people who work for the platforms, because very often they are not sure whether something should be deleted or not, and the working definition is really decisive. And once again, it's so important that so many countries adopt the working definition, because as we know, it's an international phenomenon, and we need international cooperation to fight against anti-Semitism, and the working definition is a fantastic tool to do that.
That's a great point to end on. in terms of having that definition to draw the line? Because really, I think the biggest problem of our time that we're seeing all around us is social media giants, is the sort of policing or attempt to figure out where is the line of what is free speech, what is hate speech, what is anti-Semitism, what is not. So that's a great reminder that this international definition is a good guideline to just help people figure that out in the first place, to allow for the debate and the conversation to continue in a healthy way. Dr. Felix Klein in Germany, thanks so much for being with us. And of course, to Chen, Laurel, and Carrie, all of you for sharing your stories right here with us. And we'll leave you with 2 final examples and 3 stories from Sweden to Canada. With us now are Saskia Pantel, Charles Small, and Rob Nagus. We'll also hear from the UN's Dr. Ahmed Shahid and Frankfurt Mayor Uwe Becker. But something you might have noticed in conversations in cities and campuses around the world is this: drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Saskia Pantel is president of the Zionist Federation of Sweden, and the small towns where she grew up in northern Sweden are home to idyllic views and fear for being Jewish. They're also, like cities and towns around the world, the site of anti-Semitic vandalism. Saskia, thanks so much for being with us. Tell us a little bit what you have actually just witnessed around you, and kind of how rare or not are those things?
Well, actually, I was born in America, but I moved to Sweden at a young age because my mother is Swedish. And at the time, we thought it was completely normal to have to hide your Jewish identity. And adding to the fact that we didn't know at the time, but where we were living was the neo-Nazi hotbed of the country. Now, Nazis roaming the streets started to become an anti-immigrant symbol in Sweden, but the swastikas were everywhere. And several years ago, during an anti-Israel protest in my hometown of Borlänge, I, with a journalist background, took my camera. I headed to the main square where we saw the masses handing out swastikas over the flag of Israel, and a comparison of Israel and Netanyahu with the Nazis. And this became a large news, not necessarily because of anti-Semitism, because nobody saw it as that, but they saw it as the anti-Israel protest, and it was about the anti-Israel narrative. Now, because of that, it actually became reported by somebody else. I, at the time, was too scared to report it because I was the only person there who wasn't participating. And being Jewish and living not too far away, it's quite frightening because if somebody reported it, they would know it was me. But eventually I also reported because I had all the evidence in my camera. And this was the first time where I actually had the courage to speak up, but I was so disappointed because even though I handed all the evidence in my camera, I had it on film, who handed it out, who said what, it was dismissed 6 months later on lack of evidence, and it wasn't considered anti-Semitic because it was critical of Israel. Now, this is a prime example, in my opinion, why we need the IHRA definition, because how can we even talk about this if we are not safe as Jews in a country, especially like Sweden, that values democracy that much?
Right, that's a great point. A country that is all about democratic values, and one where I'll just remind people watching of what you said at the outset, which is pretty unbelievable, that it just became normal to grow up in Sweden and have to hide the fact that you are Jewish. So Saskia, thanks very much for sharing your story and listening along to another story that really I think is a similar experience of Israeli policy being compared to Nazism. It comes out of Oxford from Charles Small. He's the director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, or ISGAP. Charles, also joining the conversation. Thanks so much for being with us. And I know that your experience actually played out at an international conference at Oxford, another place, a bastion of democratic values, like we just heard about also in Sweden. So tell us what happened there.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. So very briefly, last year in July of 2019, there was an international conference on issues of rising nationalism and racism. And a colleague of mine at St. Anthony's College in Oxford was organizing this international conference. And he's also concerned about issues of anti-Semitism. And ISGAP is an international research center, so we brought 9 prestigious international scholars to join us at Oxford to present papers on racism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. And it was an international group of professors. We were 9. We had 2 panels at the conference. And when the conference began, the proceedings were stopped. And people got up and they said they're boycotting the conference until the apartheid-supporting fascist Zionists were removed from this international conference in African studies. And we were quite shocked, and we were completely demonized. We were a diverse group of scholars of African origin from the Middle East, Israelis, Europeans, Americans. We had 3 African Americans with us from historically black universities and colleges, and they were accused of blackwashing fascist Zionism at the conference, and that the Zionists were usurping the African Studies program in Oxford. And we were banned. And Professor Mbembe was the keynote speaker. He's instrumental in the international BDS movement. And at the end of the day, the 9 of us went into a room with 1 participant. There were 125 papers presented at this conference, and 1 scholar joined us in an unofficial room where we presented our papers to each other. And to add insult to injury, I was starting a fellowship last year in September of 2019, and the people supporting my research fellowship at Oxford contacted me. And they said because of the controversy of the work of ISGAP and dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism, they were withdrawing support for my fellowship.
Wow.
And it was quite a shock. I spoke to the heads of the college and people at the university, and I explained the situation to them. And I knew that the IHRA definition was actually adopted as a guideline by Oxford University. So I knew that I had something to stand on. And sure enough, the university reviewed what had transpired, and they contacted me only a few days later, and they told me that as a graduate of Oxford University that I would always be welcome. And the head of my college, St. Anthony's College, actually, he's the person who now sponsors the fellowship here. I was able to take up the fellowship, and it's just been extended for a few more years. So
well, Charles,
I'm fortunate.
Certainly an unfortunate experience. I'm glad to hear a very practical case that you're telling us about, where this definition was actually ammunition to help you sort of lay the groundwork for what's right and what's wrong, and turn around what happened to you. A reminder to everyone watching of why we're actually here, really trying to put life, to breathe life into those definitions. And we'll go ahead and move on really to the final one, the final example from the International Holocaust Alliance that points to the sometimes blurred line between the world's Jews and the actions of one nation's government. In brief, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. And one of many public forums where this kind of anti-Semitism has played out is in Canada. Rob Nagus is the director of Hillel at the University of Toronto. He's joining us from there to explain, Rob, how some Jewish students' need for kosher food became a minefield.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So the context is it was a very natural Hillel program with some really engaged student leaders. They noticed a need on campus, which was that we wanted to get more access to kosher food. Hillel provides kosher food on a daily basis, but we're limited in how much we can offer. So we wanted to work with the university to get more access. So a couple students were incredibly ambitious and started looking to build broad coalitions of support so that we could then take it to the administration. So we've reached out to various faculties, various student groups, and to the various student unions as well, to try and get support for more kosher food on campus. It was a very altruistic vision that the students had, and it was moving quite effectively until we took it to the Graduate Student Union. Now, the Graduate Student Union at the University of Toronto is the only union in Canada that has a standing BDS committee. And when the students took it to the Graduate Student Union looking for support, they suggested that we take Hillel's name off of the Kosher Forward campaign because of the union's feelings about Israel, the Kosher Forward campaign would likely have more support if we took Hillel's name off of the campaign, and obviously that's incredibly problematic. They were essentially boycotting the entire Jewish community and how we were feeling, and really a really simple equity request that we had for access to more kosher food based on and holding everyone accountable for the actions of the Israeli government. And it was really sad and disheartening. I think one of the most problematic things, I don't know if it's whether it's reassuring or problematic, is I don't think the union really realized that they were being anti-Semitic. I think they were actually thought that they were being helpful by suggesting that.
Do you think that through that process that there was some kind of realization, that there was some kind of learning process or education about what they were doing?
So absolutely, and I think that the definitions that the working IHRA definition is so critical to the ongoing dialogue that we've been able to establish with the grad student union. We're looking to establish a Jewish student caucus through the union. And really it is about being able, until we won't be able to tackle anti-Semitism at the university until we're clearly able to define it. And the IHRA definition is our working definition. It's what we want to work with the grad student union to really try and deal with these issues head on, and hopefully have some kind of positive resolution to this.
Just briefly, Rob, is this something that you had encountered before or since? I mean, how widespread is this kind of experience on campus, whether it's coming from students, from organizations, from professors?
So generally, I think the University of Toronto, the climate is very friendly towards Jewish students, you know, and certainly in regards to any sort of religious accommodation or support for getting kosher food, everyone is on board. But particularly within the grad student union, where the BDS platform has such a strong influence over policy, I think we're beginning to see the implications of how this negatively affects the Jewish community. You know, again, we're looking to really have concrete examples and definitions of what constitutes anti-Semitism. That's the only way we're going to be able to really move forward and have hopefully some healthy resolution to this.
All right, well, it's a good ending for now. And again, another example of what we've seen in those cases where it is possible to actually have a conversation and educate and move forward and not just have that awful experience. And another case where these IHRA definitions, these international definitions of anti-Semitism can actually offer very practical advice at making it all a little bit better. So Rob Nagus, thanks very much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
And to help us tie all of this together is Dr. Ahmed Shahid. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And Dr. Shahid, you not only authored a major report on global anti-Semitism, but your work is all about sort of finding the obstacles that are standing in the way of religious freedom and really how to get over them. So share with us your take from all your experience on why these international definitions practically matter.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this important part of the important discussion. I had my report out about 1 year ago, and you can see from the reactions received that I was speaking to a problem that many recognized required urgent attention. That's because we have a very high, if you like, level of anti-Semitism already. It's becoming higher and higher. It's increasing exponentially as we speak. And we saw this during the COVID-19 outbreak, how everyone fell back on the old conspiracy theories, scapegoating of Jewish communities, and others, of course, as a way of, if you like, blaming the other. So in my work, what I really found useful was, like the previous speaker said, the need to clarify concepts, the need to clearly delineate what we mean by anti-Semitism. At the heart of anti-Semitism are conspiracy theories. And one of the examples in this is the left-wing versions of it, which are very difficult to detect because they pretend to wear the garb of anti-imperialism, anti-racism, to be decent people. But in actual fact, they do a double twist, not only of distorting racism, but also accusing those who speak out against anti-Semitism as acting in bad faith. So what is really important is to have a very clear guidance on what we mean by anti-Semitism. The 11 examples are very helpful in that regard. And I have called on all countries or all governments to embrace, endorse the IHRA working definition and use it within a human rights framework to address the challenges that Jewish communities worldwide face. I want to point out just a couple of things here. When the UN adopted back in 2005 the 27th January as the Holocaust Remembrance Day, there was immediately a response, a reaction to it from some quarters in convening a Holocaust denial conference. And I'm glad that the following year the UN came back and had its own condemnation again of Holocaust denial as well. It's a constant battle we have to get through to ensure that we combat racism, we combat xenophobia, and that these are often directed at Jewish communities. My point has been that if we really want to address this growing tsunami of xenophobia and hatred, we have to begin by attacking the oldest form of hatred that underlies all of this, and that is tackling anti-Semitism.
Well, Dr. Shahid, you mentioned a little bit about UN condemnations. Talk to us a little bit beyond that, beyond those condemnations, about how the UN itself as a body, as such a critical world body, is fighting anti-Semitism. What can be done?
Well, the UN has many parts to it. Some parts of it are disturbingly anti-Semitic in their output. The Human Rights Council has an annual debate on Israel, and some of the rhetoric, some of the way they do it is clearly anti-Semitic. And the focus on Israel, to the exclusion of many other states, is also deeply problematic. But beyond the council, there are other parts of the UN, and recently the Secretary General appointed a focal point in his office to monitor anti-Semitism. That's a very positive sign. UNESCO, at the same time, has been doing a lot of work on Holocaust education, a key instrument in addressing anti-Semitism, to ensure that young people around the world grow up knowing about the Holocaust and also learning about the Jewish experience in its totality. We see in the online space that the anti-Semitism is on the rise again exponentially. And like someone was saying some time back, we could think that the Holocaust denier, for example, was an old man, duffel coat, a dying breed. But no, with the online dimension, we've seen young people around the world embrace Holocaust denial. There are algorithms that will guide you to Holocaust denial pages on some social media platforms. So we have tackled the global problem, but most importantly in this, I think we should all recognize it's not a problem for Jews alone. It's a human rights problem that we must all tackle, and therefore the UN must take lead in doing this as a global leader for everybody.
Dr. Shahid, just before we let you go, what briefly would you say is the element that you're most concerned about? What do you have your eye on going forward in terms of this fight?
My biggest concern is that there is a direct link between anti-Semitic discourse and anti-Semitic violence. Our governments aren't doing enough either to address anti-Semitic incitement, nor are they doing enough to address, to prevent violence, or even for that matter, provide remedies to those who are affected by this. So for me, the most important element is applying a human rights framework and the rule of law to ensure that Jews and everybody else feel safe against incitement to hatred.
All right, Dr. Ahmed Shahid at the UN, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. Your experience is invaluable. Your advice is invaluable, especially in what to pay attention to now. And you might be interested in what we're about to hear as well. The mayor of Frankfurt, Germany, Uwe Becker, joining us from there. He is also a board member of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. Mayor Becker, thanks so much for being with us. And I know that you have a special event planned for next month, so tell us all about it.
Yeah, thank you, Norit, for inviting me here to address all those who have already spoken about the fight against anti-Semitism. And when we see the rise of the hate against Jews all around the world, it's not some abstract way of dealing with this issue, but it takes place in our cities, in our towns, in our counties, all around the world. And for that reason, it is necessary that we confront and fight against the anti-Semitism where it takes place. We all, as mayors and municipal representatives, have not only the opportunity, but it's our duty to work for the Jewish life, for the security of Jewish life, for that people can show and practice their Jewish belief all around the world, within the cities, within the towns, within the counties. And for that reasons, at the beginning of November, all the mayors and municipal leaders around the world are invited to join a great conference, online conference, where we will speak about the instruments and methods on how to confront hate speech, anti-Semitism at the place, in the municipalities, everywhere around the globe. And I hope that if it's the West, the East Coast of the United States, if it's within Europe, if it's in Israel, if it's elsewhere in the world, municipal leaders will join and we'll speak about the IHRA definition that we just heard about, how to introduce it, how to put it into practical politics, how to deal with the communities in bringing over the main aims and goals of the IHRA definition, how we preserve what is there in the spirit of the communities. Where Jewish life is present, it should be tomorrow. And so we will speak about all the ways how to also bring bridges and build bridges in between Jewish communities and their surroundings. And last but not least, about practical instruments, how to fight anti-Semitism in our towns.
Mayor Becker, thanks so much for telling us about that event. We'll look out for it. And it really is, I think, a great initiative because here throughout this broadcast, we've been talking about, on one hand, these individual stories and people on an individual basis trying to fight against anti-Semitism. We just heard from Dr. Shahid, who is obviously doing it on a much grander level at the United Nations. And it's so important to have that happen also within communities, because I think that's where really a lot of change actually happens on a practical level. Dr. Ahmed Shahid, I'll thank you all now. I mean, Mayor Becker, who we just heard from, the stories that we've heard throughout this broadcast, and just now from Saskia, Charles, and Rob. Thank you all for being with us, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your stories. And throughout all of this with us, of course, is the Executive Director of Combat Anti-Semitism of CAM. What are some of your final thoughts, your final takeaways from everything we've heard? I mean, we really have heard a lot of personal stories, a lot of sort of higher level stories.
So thank you everyone for being with us today. Thank you to all our speakers, to all individuals that take the time to tell their story. And thank you especially to all those that had the courage to stand up and to tell how they've been attacked over the years. And I think this is a very, very important message to everyone, that anti-Semitism today is affecting human beings, is affecting people. And it has so many, many different faces. And I think that this is what we wanted to show to everyone, that we need a definition that will answer the needs of every kind of story that we heard. And today we had 11 examples, but honestly, it's just the type of the iceberg. We have much more anti-Semitic stories around the world and happening every day. So I will not add more about the IHRA definition, since I believe that you heard a lot. But what I would like to say is that at CAM, we stand ready to work with every nation, with every country, with every city around the world to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism or IHRA, and also to find solutions in your cities, in your places. This is why next month, following the announcement of the Mayor of Frankfurt, we're going to hold this very important conference. The last thing I would like to say today is that we don't pretend at the Combat Anti-Semitism movement that we have all the solutions to combat anti-Semitism movement. But what we have an amazing network of 275 partner organizations and 280,000 individuals that together have joined the movement. And what we believe that when we come together, we can make the difference. So today I would like to invite all of you to join the Combat Anti-Semitism movement by visiting our website at combatantisemitism.org, sign or pledge to combat anti-Semitism and to make the difference.
Sasha Reutemann-Dratwa, Executive Director of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, and really the person behind all of this, behind this event in the first place, for bringing it together. So thanks so much for bringing these stories together. And really, we've heard some very powerful personal stories from California to Poland to the UK. And each one shows how the definitions of modern day anti-Semitism aren't just words on a page or some academic exercise. They're very real and very dangerous trends happening right now around the world. So we hope those stories have not only captured your attention and raised some awareness, but that they show one key thing to keep in mind, that the simple act of telling those stories, of acknowledging them and bringing them to light, is in itself a fight against anti-Semitism.